You know, when people talk about strange encounters on the night shift, most think of drunk patrons or rowdy kids causing trouble. But what happened to me? It's something I wouldn't believe myself if I hadn't lived through it. It still makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. I used to work the graveyard shift at a gas station off a lonely stretch of highway in Kansas. It wasn't the busiest spot, but truckers and night owls would stop by, keeping me just busy enough to stay awake. The station was old, one of those places where the neon sign buzzed faintly and the fluorescent lights inside flickered every so often. It had its charm, but it also had a reputation. Locals would whisper about how the place was cursed. There were stories about strange disappearances in the area and rumors that the land had a dark history tied to the old settlers. I used to laugh it off. I mean, a gas station being haunted sounded like an urban legend meant to keep kids from loitering. It was a Tuesday night, quiet even for that stretch of highway. The clock had just hit 2 a.m., and I was sitting behind the counter scrolling through my phone trying to stay awake. That's when the bell above the door chimed. I looked up, expecting to see a trucker or maybe a lost traveler, but no one was there. The door had swung open, though, and the cold night air rushed in. "Hello?" I called out, stepping around the counter. No answer. I walked to the door, half expecting to see someone outside, but the parking lot was empty. Just the faint hum of the highway in the distance and the sound of crickets. I closed the door, locking it this time, and chalked it up to the wind. But as soon as I turned back toward the counter, I froze. There was a man standing near the snack aisle, facing away from me. He hadn't been there a second ago. I was sure of it. "Sir," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we're about to close up for cleaning. Can I help you with something?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, completely still. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt, and his hair looked damp like he'd been caught in the rain. "Sir?" I repeated, louder this time. He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see part of his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes... God, I'll never forget those eyes. They were sunken, hollow, like they belonged to someone who hadn't slept in years. I took a step back. "Are you okay?" He finally moved, but not like a normal person. It was jerky, unnatural, as if he was a puppet being yanked on strings. He started walking toward me, his head tilted at an odd angle. "Stay back," I shouted, my hand fumbling for the baseball bat we kept behind the counter. But before I could grab it, the lights flickered and went out. The entire station plunged into darkness. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. I fumbled for my phone to use the flashlight, but when I turned it on, the man was gone. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice trembling. And then I heard it. A whisper, soft and raspy, coming from somewhere in the store. "Get out!" I spun around, shining the light everywhere, but I couldn't see anyone. The whisper came again, this time closer. "Leave. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, but as I reached it, I felt a cold hand grab my arm. It was ice cold, like touching something that had been in a freezer. I turned to see the man standing inches from me, his hollow eyes staring straight into mine. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I yanked my arm free and ran out into the parking lot, not stopping until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the door and get inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the gas station. He was standing in the doorway, just watching me. And then, as I blinked, he was gone. I drove straight home, not caring about leaving the station unlocked. When I told my manager the next day, he just gave me a knowing look and said, "Yeah, that happens sometimes." That's when he told me about the man who had died there years ago. Apparently, a hitchhiker had been murdered at the station back in the 80s. They never caught the killer, and the case went cold. The description of the man matched the one I'd seen perfectly. I quit a week later. To this day, I can't drive past that station without feeling a chill run down my spine. And I'll tell you this much. If you ever find yourself alone on a desolate highway at night, do yourself a favor, keep driving.
Story number 2.
I'll never forget the night I realized there are things in this world that can't be explained. Things that will haunt you long after they're gone. It was supposed to be just another routine shift, but it became the longest night of my life. I worked as a security guard at a remote warehouse on the outskirts of Pennsylvania. The place stored all kinds of things, old machinery, outdated electronics, and crates of who knows what. It wasn't exactly thrilling, but the pay was decent and I enjoyed the solitude. The warehouse was massive, with rows of towering shelves that stretched into darkness. My job was simple: walk the perimeter, check the cameras, and make sure no one was trespassing. That night started like any other. I arrived at 10 p.m., clocked in, and grabbed my flashlight. The other guard, Mike, was leaving for the night. Before he walked out, he gave me a strange look. "Something feels off tonight," he said, his voice low. "Off how?" I asked, half laughing. "I don't know. Just be careful, all right?" I waved him off, but his words lingered in the back of my mind as I began my rounds. By midnight, the warehouse was deathly quiet. The only sounds were the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of metal as the building settled. I was about to head back to the security office when I heard it, a faint, distant noise. It was a whisper. I froze, straining to listen. It came again, soft but unmistakable. "Help me." I shined my flashlight down the nearest aisle, but there was nothing there. My heart started pounding as I slowly walked toward the sound. "Hello?" I called out. No response. I kept moving, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. The whisper came again, this time closer. "Please, help me." I turned the corner, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. At the far end of the aisle, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure was crouched near one of the shelves, its back to me. It looked like a woman, her long hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. She was wearing a tattered white dress, and her bare feet were filthy. "Ma'am?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're not supposed to be here." She didn't move. I took a cautious step forward. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" Slowly, she turned her head to look at me, and my stomach dropped. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just endless darkness. Before I could react, she let out a blood-curdling scream. It wasn't human. It was high-pitched and distorted, like the sound of metal scraping against metal. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. The beam spun wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. When I grabbed it and shined it back toward the woman, she was gone. My hands were shaking as I radioed for backup, but all I got was static. "Mike? Anyone? Can you hear me?" Nothing. I decided to head back to the security office, but as I turned to leave, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I whipped around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but the aisle was empty. Then the whisper started again, louder this time. "Why won't you help me? Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice echoing through the warehouse. The air suddenly grew cold, so cold I could see my breath. The lights above me began to flicker, casting the shelves in and out of shadow. That's when I saw them. Dozens of figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies pale and emaciated. They moved in unison, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their eyes, like the woman's, were pure black. They surrounded me, their whispers blending into a chorus of despair. "Help us. You can't leave." I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into total darkness. I ran blindly, crashing into shelves and crates as I tried to find my way back to the office. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic. "Stay with us. You belong here now." Finally, I saw the faint glow of the security monitors in the distance. I burst into the office, slamming the door behind me and locking it. The monitors showed the entire warehouse, but the screens were filled with static. All except one. In the center monitor, I saw the woman in the white dress standing right outside the office door. She was staring directly at the camera, her black eyes unblinking. Then, one by one, the other figures appeared behind her, their faces pressed against the glass. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. The lights in the office flickered, and the door began to rattle as if someone was trying to force it open. In a panic, I shoved a desk against the door and crouched in the corner, clutching the flashlight like it was a weapon. The whispers grew louder, filling the room. "You can't escape. You're one of us now." I don't remember passing out, but when I woke up, it was daylight. The door was wide open, and the warehouse was silent. I stumbled outside, blinking against the sunlight, and saw Mike standing by his car. "Where the hell were you?" he asked, his face pale. "I've been trying to reach you all night." When I told him what happened, he didn't seem surprised. "This place, it's not right," he said. "There's a reason they pay so well." I quit that day. Later, I found out the warehouse had been built on the site of an old asylum that burned down in the 1950s. Hundreds of patients died in the fire, and their bodies were never recovered. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers outside my window. "Help us."
Story number 3.
It was a Tuesday night when I first noticed the strange events at the motel where I worked. I'd been the night clerk for about 6 months. managing things while the rest of the staff slept or took care of their business during the day. The place was small, not a fancy spot by any means, just an old roadside motel off a quiet highway. People often stayed overnight on long road trips, and I rarely had any complaints. That night, the rain was pouring down and the winds howled like wolves outside. It was the kind of storm that made everything feel more isolated, more claustrophobic. The dim lights flickered on and off every so often, and the sound of the rain hitting the windows made it hard to focus. The building itself creaked as though it had its own breath, a constant reminder that it was getting older. Around 2 a.m., the bell above the front door jingled, signaling a new guest. I looked up from the counter and saw a man, drenched from the rain, standing in the doorway. His clothes were soaked, his hair matted to his forehead. "Good evening," I said, offering a smile, though I felt an inexplicable sense of unease in my gut. He didn't smile back. He just stared at me, his expression blank. "I need a room," he said in a voice that seemed too calm for someone who had just walked through a storm. His eyes were dark, and there was something about them that unsettled me. I checked the register. "We have a vacancy in room 9. Will that work?" He nodded slowly. "All right, it'll be $50 for the night. I'll need your ID and a credit card, please." The man handed me his ID. It looked normal enough. His name was Richard Graham. But as I looked at the picture, a sudden, overwhelming sensation of dread washed over me. The man in the photo looked nothing like the man standing in front of me. The person in the photo had lighter hair, a more relaxed expression. This man, this Richard Graham, had eyes that seemed too hollow, too vacant. I quickly handed the ID back. "Thank you. Here's your key. Room 9 is at the end of the hall. Please let me know if you need anything." He took the key, but didn't speak. He turned and walked toward the hallway, the sound of his wet footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. I watched him disappear down the hall, feeling an odd weight in my chest that I couldn't shake. A few hours later, I was sitting at the counter, sipping on a cup of coffee to stay awake. The storm outside had only gotten worse, the wind whipping against the building like it was trying to tear it apart. And then I heard it. Faint at first, but unmistakable. A soft, muffled cry. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but the cry came again, this time louder, followed by a strange scraping noise. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. The sound seemed to be coming from the hallway outside. I hesitated. Should I go check? It could be something harmless. Maybe a pipe making a strange noise in the storm. But something told me it wasn't. Something told me that whatever was happening wasn't right. I grabbed the flashlight behind the counter and stepped cautiously toward the hall. The crying was louder now, mixed with the unmistakable sound of something or someone scraping against the walls. I reached room 9 and knocked softly on the door. "Mr. Graham? Everything all right in there?" Silence. I knocked again, harder this time. "Sir?" I reached for the doorknob and turned it. To my surprise, the door creaked open, the lock clicking in a way it shouldn't have. I stepped inside, shining the flashlight around the room. It looked normal enough, a bed, a nightstand, and a dresser. But there was something wrong. The room was freezing cold, so much so that my breath came out in visible puffs. The bed was perfectly made, the curtains drawn tight. But the sound, the crying, came again. I followed the noise, my flashlight sweeping across the room until it landed on the corner. And there, curled up on the floor, was the man from earlier, Richard Graham. But he wasn't crying. His body was twitching and jerking as if he were having a seizure. His back was arched, and his eyes, those hollow eyes, were wide open, staring at the ceiling, unblinking. "Mr. Graham?" I asked, my voice shaking. There was no response, only the sound of his body scraping against the cold floor, dragging his limbs across the carpet. I backed away, suddenly terrified. "I'm calling an ambulance," I said, fumbling for my phone. But when I looked down at it, the screen was flickering, and the call wouldn't go through. I rushed to the door to leave, but as I reached for the handle, I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle. I screamed and kicked, but the grip was too tight. I looked down. Richard Graham's hand was ice cold, and his fingers were stiff and twisted, not like a human hand at all. His eyes were no longer staring at the ceiling. They were fixed on me, wide with terror, but his body wasn't moving anymore. It was as if something, some force, had taken control of him. I yanked my foot free and bolted out of the room. I didn't know what to do. I had to get help, but the phone lines were still dead, and the storm was too intense to drive anywhere. I ran back to the front desk, gasping for air, my heart racing. I needed to leave. I couldn't stay here with whatever that was. That's when I heard it again, the cry. But it wasn't coming from room 9 this time. It was coming from the hallway. I grabbed the key for room 10 and hurried to the hallway to check the other rooms. When I reached room 10, the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with trembling hands and shone the flashlight inside. And there, in the center of the room, was a woman. She was standing with her back to me, wearing a long, dirty white gown. Her hair hung down to the floor in tangled knots. Her shoulders shook as if she were sobbing. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned to face me slowly, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. Her eyes were dark, too dark, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. But what terrified me most was the grin on her face. It wasn't a smile. It was a grotesque, twisted expression, like someone who had forgotten how to laugh but kept trying anyway. And then she spoke. "You shouldn't have come in here," she said in a voice that was not her own. It was deep, guttural, like something far older than a woman's voice. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran back to the lobby, but the bell over the door jingled again. Richard Graham was standing there, his body straight now, his eyes wide and vacant. "You can't leave," he whispered, stepping closer. Before I could react, the lights flickered one last time and went out. The motel was never found again.
Story number 4.
I don't scare easily. At least I didn't think I did. I've worked night shifts for years, warehouses, hospitals, even a morgue once. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened at the diner. It was one of those all-night places just outside of town, the kind of spot where truckers and night owls stopped for a bite. The pay was crap, the coffee was always burnt, and the jukebox hadn't worked since the 80s. But it was a job. That night started slow. By midnight, it was just me, the cook, and a couple of regulars sipping their coffee in the far corner. The storm outside had been rolling in for hours, and when it finally hit, the rain came down in sheets, rattling the windows. The sound of thunder drowned out the hum of the fluorescent lights. Around 1:30 a.m., the bell over the door jingled. I looked up from wiping the counter, expecting to see a wet trucker or maybe a lost traveler. Instead, I saw her. A young woman, maybe in her mid-20s, stepped inside. She was wearing a pale blue dress, the kind you'd expect to see in old black and white photos, and her hair was soaked, plastered to her face. She looked wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on why at first. "Evenin'," I said, forcing a smile. "Rough night?" She didn't answer, just walked toward one of the booths and sat down. Her movements were stiff, almost robotic. I figured maybe she was in shock or something. I grabbed a menu and walked over to her table. "Can I get you some coffee? Something to eat?" She didn't look at me, just kept staring out the rain-streaked window. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "Ma'am?" I asked, leaning closer. Finally, she turned her head to look at me, and my stomach dropped. Her eyes were milky white, clouded over like those of someone blind or dead. I just need to rest," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded quickly, stepping back. "Sure thing. Let me know if you need anything." I retreated to the counter, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I couldn't help but glance at her every so often. She just sat there, staring out the window, unmoving. About 20 minutes later, one of the regulars, a trucker named Dave, got up to leave. He threw a couple of bills on the counter and tipped his hat. "Stay safe out there," he said, nodding toward the storm. "Will do," I replied, glancing toward the woman. As Dave walked past her table, he paused. "Ma'am, you all right?" She didn't respond. He shrugged and headed for the door, but as he opened it, a blast of wind and rain swept in, and the woman suddenly stood up. "Don't go out there," she said sharply, her voice louder now, more forceful. Dave froze, half turning back to look at her. "What?" he asked. "Don't go," she repeated, her milky eyes locking onto his. For a moment, it felt like the air in the diner had been sucked out. Dave shifted uncomfortably, muttered something under his breath, and stepped outside anyway. The door slammed shut behind him, and the bell jingled faintly. Seconds later, there was a screech of tires and the deafening crunch of metal. I ran to the window, my heart pounding. Dave's truck had skidded off the wet road and slammed into a tree. Steam poured from the crumpled hood, and the headlights flickered weakly. "Oh my God," I gasped, grabbing the phone to call 911. As I dialed, I glanced back at the woman's table. She was gone. The booth was empty, not even wet footprints on the floor to show she'd been there. I spun around, scanning the diner. The door hadn't opened again, and there was no way she could have just disappeared. The line to 911 was ringing, but before anyone picked up, I heard it. A faint tapping sound. Tap, 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 tap. It was coming from the front door. Slowly, I turned to look. She was standing outside in the rain, her pale blue dress billowing in the wind. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her hands were pressed against the glass. "Let me in," she whispered, her voice carrying through the howling storm. I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. What do you want?" Her lips didn't move, but I heard her voice inside my head. "They don't listen," she said. "None of them listen." The lights in the diner flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The only illumination came from the occasional flash of lightning. In one of those flashes, I saw her. She was inside now, standing in the middle of the diner, her head still tilted, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "They never listen," she repeated. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. She took a step toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural. "They didn't listen," she said again, her voice echoing in my head. "And now they're gone." I tripped over a stool and fell to the floor. As I scrambled to get up, the lights flickered back on. The woman was gone. The diner was empty, save for the faint smell of rain and the lingering chill in the air. When the paramedics arrived to tend to Dave, they told me he'd been lucky. The crash looked worse than it was, and he'd walked away with just a few cuts and bruises. I didn't tell them about the woman. The next day, I asked the cook if he'd seen her. He gave me a strange look and said, "You know, there's a story about a woman who died near here years ago. Car accident. She just left this diner when it happened. They say she shows up sometimes, warning people not to go out in the storm." I quit that job a week later. Sometimes late at night, I think about her. I wonder if she saved Dave's life, or if she was the reason for the crash in the first place. And sometimes when it rains, I swear I can hear her voice whispering through the storm.
Story number 5.
I'd always considered myself a skeptic. Ghost stories, urban legends, and things that go bump in the night never fazed me. That's probably why I took the job in the first place, a night guard position at an abandoned asylum just outside of town. The money was good, and it wasn't like I had anything better to do. The asylum, built in the early 1900s, had been shut down for decades. Officially, it was condemned after years of neglect, but locals had darker theories. There were whispers about strange experiments, unexplained deaths, and patients who disappeared without a trace. I chalked it up to small-town gossip. My first night on the job was uneventful. I had a flashlight, a walkie-talkie, and an old black and white monitor to keep an eye on the crumbling hallways. The building was massive, 3 floors, countless rooms, and a basement that housed the morgue. I was told to stay out of the basement. "Structural issues," my supervisor said. That suited me just fine. It wasn't until my third night that things started to get strange. It was around 2 a.m. and I was doing my usual rounds. The halls were silent, save for the occasional drip of water or the distant creak of old pipes. My flashlight's beam swept over peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and graffiti-covered walls. I was about to head back to the security room when I heard it, a faint, muffled sound like someone crying. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere down the hall. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing. "Is someone there?" No response. I told myself it was probably just the wind or an animal that had gotten inside. Still, I couldn't ignore it. I followed the sound, my flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The crying grew louder as I approached one of the old patient rooms. The door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. "Is anyone in there?" I asked, stepping closer. The crying stopped. I pushed the door open with the tip of my flashlight. The room was empty. Just as I turned to leave, I felt it, a sudden, icy chill that seeped into my skin. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow darted across the hallway, too fast to be human. "Hey!" I shouted, giving chase. I ran down the hall, my boots echoing on the cracked tiles. The shadow turned a corner, disappearing into the stairwell that led to the second floor. I hesitated. Every rational part of me said to call my supervisor and let them deal with it. But my curiosity, or maybe my pride, got the better of me. I climbed the stairs, the old metal groaning under my weight. The second floor was even darker than the first, the windows covered in grime and boarded up in places. My flashlight barely pierced the shadows. "Whoever's up here, you need to leave." I called out. "This is private property." No response. I swept my flashlight across the hall, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, faint but unmistakable, leading down the corridor. The prints were wet, like someone had walked through water, but there hadn't been any rain that night. I followed them, each step taking me deeper into the dark. The air felt heavier here, the silence oppressive. The footprints stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall. Room 217. I reached for the doorknob, but before I could touch it, the door swung open on its own. Inside, the room was bathed in an eerie, pale light. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scrawled in what looked like chalk or something worse. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing the corner. And sitting in that chair was a figure. It was a woman, her back to me, her long, dark hair matted and tangled. She wore what looked like a hospital gown, the fabric stained and tattered. "Ma'am?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't move. I stepped closer, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. "Are you okay?" I asked again. Slowly, she began to turn her head, but it wasn't right. Her head twisted far too much, her neck bending at an unnatural angle until her face was looking directly at me. Her eyes were hollow, black voids, and her mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. "Why didn't you save me?" she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally, as though a dozen people were speaking at once. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. The light flickered, and in that split second of darkness, she was gone. The chair was empty, the room silent. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. I bolted down the hall, my flashlight bouncing wildly, and didn't stop until I reached the security room. I locked the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I sat there for the rest of the night, staring at the monitors, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I quit. A week later, out of morbid curiosity, I did some research on the asylum. I found an article from the 1950s about a patient named Eleanor Ward, a young woman who had been admitted for hysteria. The staff allegedly used experimental treatments on her, and she died under mysterious circumstances. Her room, 217. To this day, I can still see her face whenever I close my eyes. I don't work night shifts anymore, and I never, ever ignore the stories.
Story number 6.
The night my life changed forever started like any other. I was driving through the Appalachian Mountains, delivering goods for a small logistics company. The road was deserted, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. My only companions were the rumble of the truck engine and the occasional static from the radio. It was around 2 a.m. when I spotted it, a detour sign. Bright orange, reflective, and impossible to miss. "Road closed," it read with an arrow pointing left. I sighed, annoyed. The main highway was the fastest route, and this detour would add at least an hour to my trip. Still, I couldn't afford a ticket or worse, so I turned onto the side road, a narrow, winding path that disappeared into the trees. At first, it wasn't so bad. The road was paved, and the forest around me was peaceful, though unnervingly dark. But as the miles ticked by, the pavement gave way to gravel, and the trees seemed to press closer, their gnarled branches arching over the road like skeletal hands. The farther I drove, the more uneasy I felt. The truck's headlights barely seemed to cut through the thick shadows, and the air inside the cab grew colder, despite the heater being on full blast. That's when I saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road, illuminated by my high beams. It was a woman, her long, dark hair hanging over her face. She wore a white dress that billowed slightly in the night breeze, though I felt no wind. I slowed the truck, my heart pounding. "Hey!" I called through the open window. "You okay? Need a ride?" She didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me. Something about her was off. Her posture was too stiff, her stillness unnatural. "Lady, it's dangerous out here," I said again, but she didn't respond. I hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers was against company policy, but leaving her out there didn't sit right with me. I reached for my phone to call for help. Of course, there was no signal. Typical. When I looked back up, she was gone. My stomach dropped. She hadn't walked away. I'd have seen her. She had just disappeared. I slammed the truck into gear and drove, my pulse racing. The gravel road twisted and turned, and the trees grew denser, their shadows twisting like living things. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting in the back seat of the cab. After what felt like an eternity, I saw lights up ahead, a gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly. Relieved, I pulled in and parked by the pumps. The place was old, the kind of gas station that hadn't been updated in decades. The lights inside were dim, and there was no one at the counter. "Hello?" I called as I stepped inside. The place was empty, but it smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic, like rust or blood. I wandered to the back, where a door marked restroom stood slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I froze. The mirror above the sink was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. Scrawled on the remaining pieces of glass was a single word, written in what looked like dark, dried blood. Run! I stumbled backward, my breath hitching. That's when I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like nails on metal. I turned toward the sound, my heart hammering. The woman was standing in the doorway of the gas station, her face obscured by her hair. Leave, she said, her voice low and distorted like it was coming from a broken radio. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the truck, slamming the door behind me and fumbling with the keys. When the engine roared to life, I floored it, gravel spraying as I tore out of the parking lot. The road ahead was a blur, my only focus on putting as much distance as possible between me and that gas station. But no matter how fast I drove, the uneasy feeling lingered like a cold hand on the back of my neck. That's when I noticed the radio. It had been off, static, nothing but white noise. But now, faintly, I could hear something. A voice. Shouldn't have stopped. I froze. The voice was raspy, feminine, and unmistakably hers. Who's there? I demanded, glancing around the cab. The radio crackled again, louder this time. Look in the mirror. Every fiber of my being screamed not to, but I couldn't stop myself. In the rearview mirror, I saw her. She was in the back seat, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her milky white eyes boring into mine. The truck swerved as I screamed, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I looked back, the back seat was empty. The radio was silent. I drove for hours, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that place. The road eventually led me back to the main highway, and I didn't stop until I reached the next town. The next morning, I told my supervisor what had happened. He laughed it off, saying I was probably just tired and imagining things. But later, one of the older drivers pulled me aside. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked, his face pale. "Who?" I demanded. "The Lady of Hollow Road," he said. "They say she was a hitchhiker, killed on that stretch of road years ago. Now she haunts it, looking for drivers to warn or punish." I never drove that route again, but even now, whenever I'm on a dark road at night, I can feel her, watching, waiting, and I pray she doesn't decide to visit me again.
Story number 7.
I was a college student when it happened. Like most broke students, I took whatever job I could find, and that's how I ended up working as a night janitor at a local library. The library wasn't just any library. It was old, built in the late 1800s with towering shelves, creaky floors, and a history of being, as some people put it, a little odd. I didn't mind working nights. I liked the quiet, but I wasn't prepared for what I experienced in that place. It started on my third shift. I had just finished cleaning the main reading room and was heading to the second floor when I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind. The library had its share of drafts, and the old windows rattled whenever there was a breeze. But as I climbed the stairs, the whisper grew louder. It wasn't just noise. It was words. "Help me." I stopped in my tracks, every hair on my body standing on end. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty library. No response. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. The night shifts were messing with my head, that's all. But as the week went on, the whispers became more frequent. Sometimes they would come from the far end of a dark aisle, just out of reach of my flashlight. Other times they seemed to come from the air itself, circling around me like a cold breath. By the end of the week, I was jumpy and sleep-deprived. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it was all in my head. But then, I saw her. It was a little after 2 a.m., and I was cleaning the archives in the basement. The basement was the oldest part of the library, filled with dusty tomes and documents that no one ever looked at anymore. The air down there was always damp and cold, and the single light bulb cast long, eerie shadows. I was mopping near the back when I felt it. A presence. I turned around, and there she was. A girl, no older than 10, standing at the far end of the aisle. She was dressed in a white nightgown, her hair tangled and her feet bare. "Hey," I said cautiously, my voice shaking. "What are you doing down here?" She didn't respond. She just stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "How did you get in here?" I asked, taking a step toward her. Before I could get close, she turned and disappeared around the corner. I ran after her, my heart pounding, but when I turned the corner, the aisle was empty. The only sound was the faint drip of water from a leaky pipe. I searched the entire basement, but there was no sign of her. When I told my supervisor the next morning, she gave me a strange look. "You're not the first person to see her," she said quietly. "We call her the Lost Girl." According to her, the story went like this. Decades ago, a young girl named Emily had gone missing in the library. She was there with her mother, who was researching something in the archives. When her mother looked up, Emily was gone. Despite a massive search, Emily was never found. Some say she got lost in the labyrinthine aisles and died in the walls. Others believe something darker happened. Whatever the case, people claim to see her, always at night, always in the basement. I didn't want to believe it. Ghosts weren't real, I told myself. But the sightings didn't stop. She started appearing more frequently. Sometimes I'd see her reflection in the glass of the display cases. Other times I'd catch glimpses of her in the corner of my eye, only for her to vanish when I turned to look. And then there were the whispers. "Help me." Always the same two words, spoken in a voice so soft it was almost inaudible. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront her. It was a little past midnight, and I was back in the basement. The air felt heavier than usual, and the shadows seemed to cling to the walls like oil. "Emily," I called out, my voice echoing. "If you're here, show yourself." For a moment, there was silence, and then I heard it, a soft giggle, high-pitched and eerie. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. "Emily," I shouted, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The giggle stopped, replaced by a faint whisper. "Follow me." My blood turned to ice. I should have run. Every instinct in my body told me to get out of there. But I didn't. Instead, I followed the sound deeper into the archives. The air grew colder with every step, and the light from my flashlight seemed to dim, as though the darkness was swallowing it. Finally, I reached the back wall. There, scrawled in what looked like ash, were the words, "Find me." My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I felt something brush past me. A small hand, icy cold. When the light came back on, I was alone. But the wall was different. A section of the bricks looked newer, as though they'd been replaced recently. I don't know what compelled me, but I grabbed a crowbar from the janitor's closet and started prying at the bricks. It didn't take long to uncover what was behind them. A small, skeletal figure, curled into a fetal position. The remains were wearing a white nightgown, now yellowed with age. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. As I stared at the remains, I heard her voice one last time. "Thank you." When I looked up, she was standing there, smiling faintly, and then she was gone. The police were called, and they confirmed what I already knew. The remains belonged to Emily. She'd been bricked into the wall, likely by someone who worked at the library all those years ago. I quit the job the next day, but sometimes, late at night, I can still hear her voice. "Thank you." And I wonder if she's truly at peace, or if she's still lost, waiting for someone else to find her.
Story number 8.
I was 27 when I took a job as a caretaker for an estate in rural Vermont. The house was enormous, a sprawling Victorian mansion with turrets, gables, and ornate woodwork. It sat alone on a hill, surrounded by dense forest. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, I welcomed it. The owners, an older couple, lived abroad most of the year. They needed someone to keep the place in shape during the off-season. My duties were simple: make minor repairs, keep the house clean, and ensure everything was in working order. The first few days were uneventful. The house was cold and drafty, but I kept myself busy. Most of the rooms were covered in white sheets to protect the furniture, so my job was to dust, sweep, and occasionally fix a creaky hinge or a dripping faucet. But then, on my fourth night, things began to change. It started with small noises. At first, I chalked it up to the house settling. Old houses make noise, after all. But these were different. They weren't random creaks or groans. They were deliberate. Footsteps. At around 2 a.m., I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone when I heard them. Slow, heavy steps, moving across the floor above me. I froze. I was the only one in the house. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept upstairs, my heart pounding. The footsteps seemed to lead me to one of the guest rooms at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, except for a single rocking chair in the corner. It was moving. Back and forth, creaking softly with each motion. I stood there, frozen, my breath catching in my throat. After what felt like an eternity, I stepped forward and stopped the chair. The moment my hand touched the wood, the room went ice cold, and I felt it, a presence. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but I was alone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the owners to ask if they'd experienced anything strange in the house. They hesitated before answering. "Well, the house is old," the husband said finally. "Sometimes it holds on to things." "What do you mean by that?" I asked, but he quickly changed the subject. That was when I realized they knew more than they were letting on. That night, I decided to stay awake and see if the footsteps would return. I sat in the living room with a book, the house eerily silent around me. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the footsteps started again. This time, they were faster, heavier, almost frantic. They moved down the stairs, through the hall, and into the living room, and then they stopped. Right behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. And yet, I could feel it. The air was thick, oppressive, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. A whisper answered, so soft I barely caught it. "Get out." I didn't wait to be told twice. I grabbed my keys and fled to my car, speeding down the winding driveway to the nearest motel. The next morning, I returned to the house, determined to grab my things and quit the job. But as I walked through the front door, I noticed something I hadn't before. There were scratches on the walls, deep, jagged gouges as though something had clawed at the plaster. They weren't there the night before. Terrified but curious, I began to explore the house, looking for more signs. In the basement, I found them. The walls were covered in scratches, symbols, and words. Most of it was gibberish, but one phrase kept appearing over and over. "She is here." I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when I heard it, a faint humming, like a woman singing a lullaby. The sound was coming from the far corner of the basement, where an old trunk sat covered in dust. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I approached the trunk. The humming grew louder. With shaking hands, I opened it. Inside was a collection of old, faded photographs, a child's dress, and a small porcelain doll. The air around me grew colder and the humming stopped. And then a voice. "Why did you leave me?" I spun around, but the basement was empty. The doll in the trunk suddenly fell over, its glassy eyes staring up at me. That was enough for me. I slammed the trunk shut and bolted out of the basement. I called the owners again, demanding to know what was going on. This time, they told me the truth. The house had belonged to their family for generations. Decades ago, a little girl named Annabelle had lived there. She was the youngest daughter of the original owners and had died tragically in the house, falling down the basement stairs while playing with her doll. "People say she never left," the wife admitted, her voice shaking. "She's attached to that house." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I snapped. "We didn't think she'd bother you," the husband said. "She usually doesn't, unless she's upset." "Upset?" I didn't bother asking what they meant. I packed my things and left that day, vowing never to return. But even now, I can't escape her. Sometimes late at night, I hear the humming, and when I close my eyes, I see her, standing at the foot of my bed, clutching her doll.
Story number 9.
I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else and nothing ever really happens. But one thing about our town set it apart: the abandoned Fairview Asylum. It was a massive, crumbling structure at the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown trees and rusting gates. The asylum had been closed for decades, its history shrouded in rumors of mistreatment, abuse, and mysterious deaths. As kids, we told stories about it, about the patients who never left, about the shadows in the windows, and about the strange lights people swore they'd seen at night. I never believed those stories. Not until the night I went inside. It was late October, and my best friend Danny dared me to explore the asylum with him. "Just for fun," he said, though the nervous look in his eyes betrayed his own fear. I didn't want to go, but my pride got the better of me. So on Halloween night, armed with flashlights and a couple of old camping lanterns, we climbed the rusted gate and made our way inside. The air inside the asylum was heavy, damp, and smelled of mold and decay. The walls were covered in graffiti, and broken furniture littered the floors. Our footsteps echoed eerily in the empty halls. "See?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's just an old building. Nothing scary about it." Danny didn't respond. He was staring down a dark hallway, his flashlight beam trembling slightly. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "Hear what?" A soft thump echoed from somewhere deep in the asylum. "Probably just an animal," I said, though my voice was shaking now. We pressed on, exploring room after room. Most were empty, but a few had old, rusted hospital beds or wheelchairs. In one room, we found a faded journal lying on the floor. The pages were brittle, the writing almost illegible, but one entry stood out. "They're watching us. The doctors don't believe me, but I can feel them. They're always here, in the shadows. Danny looked at me, his face pale. Let's get out of here. But I wasn't ready to back down. Come on, we've barely explored anything. Don't wimp out now. Reluctantly, he followed me deeper into the building. That's when we found the basement stairs. They were narrow, steep, and plunged into total darkness. No way, Danny said, backing away, but I was determined. It's just a basement, I said. Probably where they stored supplies or something. Let's check it out. I started down the stairs, my flashlight barely illuminating the way. Danny hesitated, but eventually followed. The basement was colder than the rest of the building, the air so thick it was hard to breathe. The walls were damp, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of grime. And then we saw it. A door at the far end of the basement, slightly ajar. A faint light was spilling out from inside. Danny grabbed my arm. Let's go. Now, but I couldn't move. Something about the light drew me in like a moth to a flame. Hello, I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. No response. I stepped closer, and the light flickered like a dying candle. Stop, Danny hissed, his voice trembling. This isn't funny anymore. Ignoring him, I pushed the door open. The room inside was small, barely larger than a closet. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn in what looked like charcoal or dried blood. In the center of the room was a single chair, old and rusted, with leather straps hanging from the arms and legs. But that wasn't what made me freeze. It was the figure sitting in the chair. At first, I thought it was a mannequin. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its head was tilted downward, its face obscured by stringy black hair. But then it moved. Its head snapped up, and I saw its eyes, black, empty voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. Danny screamed, and the thing in the chair let out a guttural, inhuman sound that sent shivers down my spine. I don't remember running, but the next thing I knew, we were back in the main hall, panting and trembling. Let's get out of here, Danny shouted, his voice cracking. We bolted for the exit, but as we reached the front door, it slammed shut in our faces. Something heavy and unseen pressed against the door, holding it closed, and then the whispers started. They came from all around us, overlapping, growing louder and more frantic. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in voices that didn't sound human. Danny was crying now, pounding on the door, begging to be let out. Desperate, I turned back toward the hall, and that's when I saw them. Figures, shadowy and distorted, emerging from the walls. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes with tangled strings. One by one, they turned toward us, their faces featureless but somehow filled with malice. Run, I screamed, grabbing Danny's arm and dragging him toward the back of the building. We found an open window and scrambled through it, cutting ourselves on the broken glass. We didn't stop running until we were back at my house, slamming the door shut and locking it behind us. Neither of us slept that night. The next morning, we told ourselves it was just a bad dream, that we'd imagined the whole thing. But when I reached into my pocket, I pulled out a piece of paper I didn't remember taking. It was a page from the journal we'd found, the words scrawled in shaky handwriting. They never let you leave. For weeks after, I felt like I was being watched. Shadows in my room seemed darker, longer, and sometimes I'd hear whispers just as I was falling asleep. Danny moved away a month later, refusing to talk about what had happened. As for me, I've never gone back to the asylum, but some nights, when the house is quiet, I hear it. The faint creak of footsteps, the whispers in the dark, and I know deep down that they're still watching.
Story number 10.
It was a crisp autumn night when I took up a part-time gig as a night security guard at a small family-owned motel off Route 66. I thought it would be easy money, just sitting in the lobby, checking cameras, and making the occasional patrol. The place was old but charming, with a retro neon sign that flickered a dull vacancy into the darkness. Little did I know, this job would change my life forever. The first couple of nights were uneventful. The most excitement I had was chasing off a raccoon that got into the trash. But on my third night, something felt off. The air was heavier, the silence louder, and there was this faint, inexplicable smell, something metallic mixed with damp earth. Around 2 a.m., the motel was eerily still. I was scanning the security monitors when I noticed a strange glitch on camera 3, which covered the back parking lot. The screen flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing near the dumpster. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. The figure was gone. Just my imagination, I muttered, though my pulse quickened. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to check. The night was cool, and the wind carried a faint rustle of dry leaves. I shined the beam toward the dumpster. Nothing. Just trash bags piled high and the hum of the neon sign. As I turned to head back inside, I heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, low and raspy, like someone trying to speak through water. Help me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Hello? Is someone there? I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was the distant howl of a coyote. I shook it off and went back inside, convincing myself it was just the wind playing tricks. The next night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the old building made me jump. Around the same time, 2 a.m., the lobby lights flickered, and the faint smell returned, stronger this time. I checked the cameras again, and this time there was no mistaking it. A figure shrouded in shadow stood at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the lights. I grabbed the walkie and called the front desk clerk, Maria, who was the only other person on duty. "Maria, do you see anyone outside?" "No," she replied, her voice sleepy. "Why?" "There's someone out there," I whispered, my eyes glued to the monitor. The figure didn't move, but seemed to grow darker, as if absorbing the light around it. Maria came to the lobby, her face pale. "I don't see anyone," she said, peering through the glass doors. "But they're right there," I insisted, pointing at the monitor. To my horror, the figure was now closer, standing under the flickering neon sign. Yet, when I looked out the door, there was nothing there. Maria frowned, clearly unnerved. "Maybe it's a glitch," she suggested, though her voice betrayed her doubt. That night, I barely made it through my shift. The figure haunted my thoughts, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw its shadowy outline. On my 5th night, things escalated. I was patrolling the 2nd floor when I heard heavy footsteps behind me. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the dim hallway. No one was there. I walked faster, my heart pounding, when I heard it again. This time, it was accompanied by that same raspy voice. "Help me." I turned the corner and saw a door ajar at the end of the hallway. Room 217. My stomach dropped. That room had been vacant for years, according to Maria. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run. The door creaked open further as I neared. I shined my flashlight inside and froze. The room was empty, but the smell was overwhelming, metallic and earthy, like blood and soil. On the mirror above the dresser, something was scrawled in what looked like blood. "Leave." My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to back away. As I did, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I bolted down the hallway, not stopping until I was back in the lobby. Maria found me shaking and pale. When I told her what happened, she went rigid. "Room 217, she whispered. "That's where it happened." "What happened?" I demanded, though part of me didn't want to know. She hesitated, then sighed. "Years ago, a woman checked into that room. She was running from someone, an abusive boyfriend, I think. She begged for help, but no one did anything. The next morning, they found her body. She'd been strangled and left in the bathtub. Her boyfriend was never caught." My blood ran cold. "And you didn't think to tell me this?" "We don't talk about it," she said, her voice trembling. "But you're not the first to see things." The rest of my shift was a blur. I refused to patrol alone, and Maria stayed in the lobby with me until sunrise. But the real horror came the following night. It was my final shift. I had decided to quit, but I needed the paycheck. At exactly 2 a.m., the power went out. The lobby plunged into darkness, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the windows. I fumbled for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I felt it. A cold hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, but no one was there. My flashlight flickered to life, and I saw them. Not just one figure, but many. Shadowy, distorted shapes filled the lobby, their eyes glowing faintly. They surrounded me, their whispers merging into a deafening cacophony. "Help us! Help us!" I stumbled back, my heart racing, when one of them stepped forward. It was a woman, her face pale and bruised, her eyes pleading. "You have to stop him," she said, her voice barely audible. "He's still here." Before I could respond, the figures vanished and the power came back on. The lobby was empty, but the message was clear. The motel wasn't haunted by random spirits. It was him, the boyfriend. His presence lingered, feeding on the fear and pain he'd caused. I didn't wait for morning. I left the motel that night, quitting without notice. I never looked back, but I still dream about that woman's face, her desperate plea echoing in my mind. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed, tried to help. But then I remember those glowing eyes and the cold touch of the dead. Some things are better left behind.